So, as I'm sure by this point many of you are quite well aware, recently a communication graduate teaching assistant, Lindsay Shepherd at the University of Wilfrid Laurier in Ontario, made international headlines across various outlets, and particularly caused a series of waves across academic circles after she recorded a disciplinary, quote, hearing between herself, her advisor, and another faculty member at the institution in response to her having played a clip from a Canadian television program featuring fellow Canadian and tenured professor at the University of Toronto, Dr. Jordan Peterson, and his colleague at the University of Toronto, Dr. Nicholas Matt, on the subject of pronoun usage and non-binary genders. In the clip, which features Lindsay in tears as the faculty repeatedly accuse her of not only violating the university's own gender violence rules, which are extensive and confusing to say the least, but moreover accuse her essentially of violating Canadian law merely for playing the clip as being the equivalent of violence against trans people.
So under that, gendered violence doesn't just include sexual violence, but it also includes targeting folks based on gender. So that includes transphobia, biphobia, homophobia. All those sorts of things are protected under the policy. And so those are things that Laurier has upheld as values as well as the Ontario Human Rights Code. And so those are things that we're responsible for not impacting our students in that way and not spreading transphobia in that way.
Okay, so what I have a problem with is I didn't target anybody. Who did I target?
Trans folks.
How? By telling them ideas that are really out there? By telling them that? By telling them?
As well as their egregious overuse of the term problematic in a way that I have not seen since, well, geez, the last time I played a Life is Strange game tends to overuse the term hella. And we'll get a little bit into the clip itself, but yes, they use the term problematic far too much, to the point where it is problematic. Lindsay insists throughout this, quote, discussion, that the clip was played to foster discussion and was played without tacit approval nor with reproach toward the positions held by either man in the clip, neither Dr. Peterson nor Dr. Matt. And while she seemingly goes on over the course of 40 minutes to desperately attempt to explain to her own advisor, and by the way guys, her advisor, the person ostensibly a graduate student should be able to trust the most, the importance of freedom of speech, expression, and the open marketplace of ideas, the very foundations of the concept of the academy, over 40 minutes, can't seem to get much out of him outside of his dismay and disgust. Yes, that's right, over 40 minutes, the person you should be able to trust most completely sits there and essentially calls her problematic and awful and equates Dr. Peterson to Hitler.
Would you show something in your tutorial that you had, white supremacists and non-white supremacists debating whether or not other people should live in North America? Is that something that you would show?
If that was related to the content of the week and we were talking about right-wing speech bubbles, maybe.
All for playing a clip and having her class debate it. Just talk about it. An actual open discourse is problematic, awful, and potentially maybe grounds for expulsion. We don't know. But I can tell you, having been in Lindsay's position, well, not quite, but having certainly been a graduate student, it would have scared the pants off of me to have been in this room and to been the subject of this inquiry. The clip, which I'm sure many of you have seen, and if you're interested, there will be a link below, the whole 40 full horrible minutes of it, I will be going over in some detail, but it has gone more or less viral, and as such, I'm not going to go super in-depth. I will talk a little bit at the end, but we have more pressing matters. But since it has gone viral, it has of course begun sparking apologies not only from her advisor, but the school at large, including the school's president, although I hesitate to call these statements released as true expressions of remorse over their misbehavior, merely rather over having been caught red-handed engaging in thought policing. It's also, as well, sort of propelled Lindsay into worldwide attention, with free speech now becoming a frontline issue at Wilfrid Laurier, and with the whole eye of the world turned to stare at the ideological black hole of the academy, or so it has seemingly become. Once again, we must go back to look at the Academy, at the Ivory Tower, to see just how far it has fallen into a cesspool of unintellectual anti-education. While plenty of people have covered this topic, I think I have a bit of a unique perspective, and may be able to not only provide a unique perspective, but a unique context and explanation to this story from a sort of insider position. Not only as someone who has worked in academe, but as someone in this precise fucking field of study. Oh, Jesus fucking Christ, you cannot imagine the migraine that this story originally gave to me over that particular bit. Oh yes, these are my people. But anyway, I also think that I need to give my 2 cents because I think we need to examine pedagogy, critical thinking at large, as well as the problems faced by graduate students such as Lindsay. Not just graduate students, undergrads as well. Anyone exposed to this type of academic, nigh-religious ideological orthodoxy, particularly when it pertains to outcomes for both undergrads and graduate students who might dare to question the held narrative of their advisors, their faculty, their teachers, manifesting potentially in maladaption of the academic system. Well, that seems without question at this point, but we'll get there. Such as, though, through imposter syndrome, low self-efficacy, low motivation, less self-regulated educational strategies, and as such, diminished educational outcomes. Because here's what I think is important. You could argue with me all day that this clip was bad, that Dr. Peterson is literal Hitler, that Lindsay broke some kind of rule and hurt trans people by merely playing a clip that aired on Canadian television and somehow caused physical harm to them, which is an absurdity. But hey, hang on. You could argue that to me. Given that a lot of these people do not believe in a objective reality, I can't really do much to combat that sort of claim. If you say that you were hurt psychologically or physically by having to listen to something that was aired on television and that you can easily find on YouTube, I really can't say that you weren't. I mean, we could conduct some extensive tests and I could look at your brain and probably find you weren't so much, but fine, I get the argument. What I cannot sit by and just allow it to happen without any comment is for students who are paying money, or not, whatever, students who are at least paying time to be at this institution ostensibly and for the purpose of attaining a higher education, of gaining greater knowledge, to be served this disservice. That is, I'm sorry, I cannot allow that to happen. Students are not being educated, and it doesn't have to do with my ideology versus your ideology. It has to do with the fact that the stated purpose of the course in which this clip was shown, and pretty much the stated purpose of all higher education, is not being achieved through this stifling of speech and this retardation of the growth of students' ability to think critically. Okay, so to start, let's break down this entire situation into some levels of context, right? I know I've already gone off and waxed philosophical a little bit, but let's get into the nitty-gritty. First of all, what is this horrible, problematic clip that I'm mentioning? What is this clip that Lindsay played to trigger her students into complaining to the faculty? Which I would like to point out, and for all of this, I will of course always be speaking as an American and a proud member of Burgerland, and not as a fucking leaf, and wow, imagine my shock that the symbol of this prestigious institution of higher learning is similarly represented by, you guessed it, a fucking leaf. Anyway, my point is that I can only speak to how American academic institutions work, not any institution of any other country, of course, so take that as it may be. There is, though, that some things mentioned in the trial by the faculty, I mean, not the trial, the hearing, I mean the meeting, are likely legitimate concerning the student complaints. For example, Lindsay at one point asks how many students came forward to complain and what the precise complaint was, only to be told that that was confidential. Given my experience with Title IX, this is logical to prevent students from being identified and potentially harassed or mistreated as a result of them coming forward with information. This does serve a purpose, and as such it's not really that unusual for the faculty to be unable to explain who or how many students complained about the clip. However, we're going to take a real wild guess, just a shot in the dark. I would imagine it was a fairly small number, if not in excess of a single individual, who probably looks something like this.
Look at her shark face, have a look at her with that demon face. That's a frickin' demon! We're gonna have President Linda Blair, people! And I'm not gonna go along with it!
But anyway, what was this awful, terrible, horrible clip? Well, if you watch any number of skeptics, damn, you've actually probably seen it before. It's this conversation, again, between Matt and Peterson, which, despite these absolute smugness levels achieved from the consistent sniffing of his own farts, practically dripping off of Matt, is actually, generally speaking, a fairly civil debate, and again was aired on television, wherein this panel discusses the concept of multiple genders and gender pronouns, although Matt dislikes the very idea of pronouns for whatever reason. He's going real off the reservation, so it's difficult to find a common ground here for Dr. Peterson or anyone in this debate, but hey, I would say this. Although it's a fairly hilarious segment, it is, at least in my opinion, far from vitriolic, incendiary, or any kind of clip that would make one mad, upset, or certainly feel violated. And it certainly does nothing, as far as I can determine, that would give credence to the vague similarities to Hitler that were drawn to Dr. Peterson during Lindsay Shepherd's inquisition by her advisor, Dr. Rambukkana. But still, whoa, Aiden, this is a communication graduate student playing a clip that could possibly be considered controversial in the first place, even if it is just a polite conversation that any student in her classroom could have easily come across, not only on actual television, but just on the internet in general. I mean, why was she playing this? Right? It's still potentially upsetting. I mean, according to her advisor, who, by the way, specializes in the study of privilege and, oh, you can't make this up, non-monogamy. I'm sure that's all much the surprise of you all, right? But according to him, this could have seriously injured trans students. Right, so we should be very upset. She should not have shown this, of course. I mean, it's essentially violence. Why was she showing this clip in her classroom? Well, friends, it might have something to do with the fact that the title of this course, which is Communication Studies 101, is Canadian Communication in Context, which is, according to the course description online, an introduction to key issues in Canadian communication studies from a variety of perspectives, including topics such as social history of communication in Canada, public policy and politics, and popular culture. Well, again, Dr. Rambukkana, Lindsay's advisor's own syllabus for the course, which I found online, which, just based on my experience, is most likely an identical syllabus to her syllabus, further states that the purpose of this course is an introduction for students to, quote, the contemporary communication and media landscapes of Canada, including Canada's place in the global mediascape. It introduces students to central institutions, issues, and debates that are key to understanding media and communication in Canada and their effects. By the way, would like to point this out, Dr. Rambukkana, you used the wrong form of effect there. It's with an E, not with an A. But, excuse me, their effects on our cultural milieu. Students will explore a variety of topics, including CanCon regulations and their operations in relation to Canadian music, film, and cultural industries. We will be critically reflecting on our media use and our relationships to media through the course. Special emphasis will be put on critical thinking, critical analysis, and the process and skills needed for academic writing in the tutorial sessions. I want that last line to really strike home, because the purpose of this course is analysis of media, which the clip was, but moreover, special emphasis will be placed on critical thinking, critical analysis. That's very important to keep in mind as we go forward to understand why this course is not only a disservice to Lindsay, if she apparently did the course itself a disservice by showing this clip, but why it would be a disservice to students to not show such a clip, to not engage in this type of discourse. And by the way, guys, I've taken courses very similar to this. Here, I actually found this in my downloads folder. This is COM 211, Media Literacy, that I apparently took in the spring of 2011. It says, the goal of this course is designed to help you become a more intelligent and discriminating consumer of media. You will develop the ability to analyze, assess, and critically evaluate media texts, images, sounds, and representations. You will also develop awareness and understanding the media roles in news, advertising, entertainment, ideology, and power. We will accomplish this through lecture discussion, individual exploration, and an abundance of interaction with media. Holy shit! Well, The professor I had that with didn't even go so far as to say that critical thinking and critical analysis skills, that's in a 200 level class, would be the outcome of the course. But again, it's important to keep this in mind. Critical thinking, that is the purpose of this introductory course. This is a 100 level required course for communication majors that introduces Canadian social, public policy, and political issues to students. That's the intended purpose of the course. And the teacher of the course included a clip of 2 Canadian professors in related fields of social science that was aired on public television discussing a widely contested hot political topic of interest to Canadian citizens. Well, gee, I can't imagine anything less related to the course topic. And just in case you have no experience with communication courses, again, from my basic skimming of what this course appears to be, it is a media literacy course, with an emphasis once more on critical thinking concerning current events and topics. Although being an introductory 101 course, it also focuses on simplistic, non-critical skill memorization, such as how to do citations, research skills, and idea organization. This course description is of particular import when you consider Dr. Rambakana's non-apology that he issued in the wake of the audio files being released, in which he described his issues with the clip being that it was, quote, not appropriate for the given coursework, by stating his main concern was, quote, in finding out why a lesson on writing skills had become a political discussion, end quote. Again, given the inherent intersection with politics, such a course on media literacy should be expected to provide by the very nature of its course description, Dr. Rambakana, of your course description. I would be more surprised for the course to include content unrelated to Canadian politics and popular culture, don't you think? And speaking of that apology, while Dr. Rambakana claimed that he did not intend to liken Dr. Peterson to Hitler, which he did, he continues in his letter to insist that showing this clip, easily accessible, not only on the internet, but a clip that was aired on Canadian television, was akin to showing a Hitler speech without context. Although again, by the way, for the sake of argument, even if it was, for the sake of your argument, Dr. Rambakana, if it was the same thing as showing a Hitler speech, if this man might as well be named Adolf, and this was a class on the topic of communication during World War II, rather than modern communication in Canada, I would equally expect an actual Hitler speech. Not a television program of 2 men supposedly having a polite discussion on a topic of relevance to the course, to be shown to facilitate classroom discussion and critical thinking skills if that was the topic of the course. Which again, developing critical thinking skills? That's stated in your course description. That is this course's purpose. But perhaps I'm just expecting too much from the faculty of this Leafland institution. Or moreover, perhaps I'm expecting too much from the students, because they are helpless idiots who just cannot be expected to deal with real life, apparently. Throughout both the face-to-face reprimand and the subsequent letters and videos that have come out, the faculty seem particularly concerned that this content is not only extreme, but in particular that it is too difficult for 18-year-olds to handle as freshmen in college.
These are very young students, and something of that nature is not appropriate to that age of student, because they don't have...
18?
Yes.
They're adults.
Yes, but they're very young adults. They don't have the critical toolkit to be able to take it apart yet. This is one of the things that we're teaching them.
And that being exposed to these ideas is potentially detrimental to students, particularly without a narrative, I mean proper context. Well, I'd say that's potentially not only a contentious position to hold hard toward, but actually rather, in and of itself, detrimental to student learning. As you all likely know, I tend to prefer quantitative data over qualitative, but in order to come from a place perhaps more familiar to someone like Dr. Rambakana, those who believe more in narratives and in grounded theory, I still think that avoiding all information in class can be detrimental to student thinking, and I don't think so without any evidence, particularly I will be citing some evidence both from your sort of field of study and from mine. I thought then perhaps as such we should look at narrative pedagogy, which has been studied in the context of nursing students and is potentially of particularly advantageous usage when describing complex situations such as a political discourse, similarly to how do I deal with a patient who is struggling with cancer. These are complicated things, so we may have to use a complicated way of describing things to students in order for them to learn. As such, if we are describing these things through stories or through messages rather than just mere information, it may allow students to form their own opinions and their own concepts, their own methods of dealing with an issue, rather than merely being fed facts. And as always, I will be bringing this back to quantitative stuff, but right here I'm drawing on the hermeneutical framework from Ironside 2003 regarding nursing students and narrative pedagogy. The reason I want to bring this up is because it's the type of learning we might see more popular in the social justice circles, in that it focuses on creating a lived experience-based approach to creating understanding and thinking about a complex topic, essentially thinking outside of the box. But it is oriented to the unique differences possessed by each individual student and the myriad of the dyadic teacher-student relationships each student is going to have with his or her instructor. Whoops, I'm sorry, I think I forgot some pronouns there, but whatever. The point is that in the research involving nursing students, Ironside 2003 found that students said that they felt as if they learned more when they were given prompts based on teacher stories and open-ended questions rather than simple factual information. As such, we might expect students to think more about these topics when a clip like this is played and left open to the floor for discussion, which according to Lindsay was the case, igniting what she described as the most interesting in-class discussion of the semester. In that instance, one could suggest that the discussion, that allowing students to see media and assess it based on their own lived experiences, this is your guys' phrase, social justice types, their own lived experiences, facilitates a complex discussion and would seemingly be in line with the course description of fostering critical thinking and critical analysis, right? Moreover, it would allow students to form their own opinion rather than be fed a narrative to regurgitate. But first, let's start out by defining what is critical thinking. Critical thinking, and pretty much anything when it comes to pedagogy, can be traced to John Dewey, 1933 for the seminal, in his description of reflective thinking, in which he defines as, quote, in distinction from other operations to which we apply the name of thought. It involves 1. A state of doubt, hesitation, perplexity, mental difficulty, in which thinking originates, and 2. An act of searching, hunting, inquiring, and finding material that will resolve the doubt, settle and dispose of the perplexity. See page 12. Already we can see sort of what separates reflective thinking, deeper critical type thinking, from other types of thought or reaction, in that this reflective, this critical thinking involves doubt and uncertainty. Basically speaking, I don't really know, therefore I have to think about it. I have to really go into this information and figure out what's going on, because the answer is not self-evident to me. This is essentially the synthesis of all of our extant information we have in our heads. Our brains are libraries, right? But sometimes we don't know how to connect ideas. True critical thinking is going into that library, finding 2 different books, and figure out how the topics within relate to one another. Also, we can already call back to that narrative pedagogy research regarding nursing students, in that uncertainty and falsifiability of potential beliefs in that research were identified as unique aspects of teaching style, in that facts were just not provided, but rather methods or schema were allowed to be arrived at through intense thought based on history and synthesis of information. That is, the teacher did not tell the nursing students how to think. The teacher gave them questions, or gave them a story, and asked them how would you respond in this instance. This is a higher level of thinking. This isn't just repeating something you've heard. The complexities of how individuals come to understand knowledge has been analyzed at length in many fields of research, but in terms of critical thinking, we should look at Mesereau 1991's theory of transformative learning, which describes several levels of learning and understanding of concepts as greater or lesser in comprehensiveness, from the beginning at habitual action, to understanding, to reflection, and finally to critical thinking. Habitual action is simple memorization, or studying to answer a question to a multiple choice task. This does not imply any level of true cognizance of the meaning of the answer, only an ability to recognize patterns. Through a pattern of associations, one can come to hear a bell and salivate, for example, in the traditional Pavlovian experiment, and therefore more intellectually associate the sound of a bell with food, with nourishment. However, this is a mere exposure to associated concepts. This does not illustrate any form of understanding. This is habitual action. The next level, then, is understanding. Understanding is just that, to be aware on a basic level of a concept, and to understand what the term means, but not to grasp all of the nuance involved in that term. That there is a difference between being able to associate ideas heuristically within the brain and to be able to actually define what a term means and understand that meaning. That is understanding. For example, the term solipsistic interojection. That sounds kind of complex, right? But you could easily learn to remember that solipsistic interojection is associated with some other terminology on a multiple choice test. On a higher level of comprehension, you would understand that the phrase solipsistic interojection describes how one plans out anticipated communication in one's own head. You know, when you plan out how you think a conversation's gonna go and then it totally doesn't go that way, expectations versus reality and all that. But next, you have reflection. And going off of the previously given example, that might mean not just understanding what solipsistic interojection is, but thinking back into times where you personally have experienced this effect, and how it may have impacted your life. When were there times where you engaged in solipsistic interojection, and how did that affect your communication with a person once you actually were engaging with them after the premeditated and planning stage, right? Finally, there is true critical thinking involving the synthesis of information, wherein one can do more than simply identify a phenomena and instances in which one has experienced said phenomena in the past, but even predict when that phenomena may reoccur in the future and under what conditions due to a holistic understanding. And moreover, what does that phenomena potentially mean or represent? Why do we plan out our conversations in our head? What purpose might this behavior serve to human cognition and human behavior? Those type of questions, that is critical or reflective level thinking. But Aiden, what does this concept of critical thinking have to do with Lindsay Shepherd and her class or any of this bullshit involving Wilfrid Laurier? According to Mesereau's review of his theory of transformative learning in 1997, quote, learners need be assisted to participate effectively in discourse. Discourse is necessary to validate what and how one understands, or to arrive at best judgments regarding belief. In this sense, learning is a social process, and discourse becomes central to making meaning. Did you guys get that? That is, to truly understand a concept, discourse, communication, and discussion is highly at least advantageous to arrive at higher levels of comprehension. Basically, people don't just develop critical thinking. They need to talk, they need to engage in discourse, they need to engage in communication in order to arrive at these higher levels of critical thinking. Merely providing information to a student is not going to help. It will potentially stunt that said student's learning and their learning potential, and it's going to keep them at the level of habitual action. They're not going to rise above into understanding, into reflection, and certainly not to critical thinking. Tell me once again, Dr. Rambakana, what is the purpose of your course? It is critical thinking. Going back again to the wealth of information present on nursing students, for example, Diekelman 1993 identified through a similar hermeneutical analysis that the type of learning potentially associated with narrative pedagogy is that nursing students who engaged in more critical thinking were also more autonomous in their practice. I'm not just giving you quantitative shit this time, guys. I'm giving you quant and qual. This is good for students to talk and to think outside of the box. You have to provide them with novel situations, otherwise their knowledge will be stunted. They will not grow beyond regurgitation. Of course, any good educator should want their students to reach a level of critical thinking regarding any subject matter. Even more so when, again, it's a stated goal in your fucking syllabus. But, of course, there are all kinds of typical obstacles in the way of achieving these high levels of conceptual understanding, which are facilitated not only by the instructor, but of course by the student in his or her own self-regulated learning. That is, the cognitive and metacognitive strategies used by any individual student to more thoroughly increase his or her knowledge and comprehension of a topic. These strategies can manifest through highlighting or note-taking, forms of physical behavior, or on a more internal dimension through habitual planning, goal setting, and monitoring of one's own goals and ongoing understanding of a topic. all of which are positively associated with learning outcomes. You can see Pinterest and DeGroot 1990 or Zimmerman and Shook 1989 for an overview. We basically find that when students engage in more of these self-regulated learning behaviors, they perform generally more efficiently in higher education and all education environments. I know your teacher probably told you to take notes. Well, we find that generally it works, but hang on, there's some caveats there. Put a whole bunch of asterisks and echoes. How then might educators encourage students to engage in these positive behaviors and increase their potential for higher understanding and arrive at true critical thinking skills regarding a topic? Well, as often in social science, this is a bit of a no shit factor here, eh? Students are more interested and as such will engage more in self-regulated learning behaviors when they're simply more interested in a topic matter and are truly interested in it for their own personal reasons, rather than merely for the purpose of getting good grades. In fact, Pinterest 1999 found that extrinsic goals, that is just academic success for success's sake, was actually negatively associated with self-regulated learning strategies. Students want to learn more when the topic is interesting to them intrinsically, when they actually find it engaging, not just because they want an A. Moreover, there is another important factor identified in the self-regulated learning research that consistently appears as highly correlated to any individual learning stratagem: self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is, simply put, the extent to which one believes he or she can achieve the desired outcome. To explicate, let me tell you all a little tale about how I was first really exposed to the concept of self-efficacy, although not in such clinical terms, if you want to call it that. Back many ages ago, during the fabled era of MySpace, there were these dumb little personality quizzes that were all the rage, because they're certainly not still worth $10 today. But anyway, you would take these little personality quizzes so you could hastily copy and paste a generic blurb that supposedly described deep insights into the self onto your sloppy HTML nightmare page, complete with looping MIDI files of anime opening theme songs. Or, well, maybe that was just me. But anyway, I was taking one of these insipid little tests with my friend, and I came across one of the following questions. It said essentially, quote, "I believe I can accomplish anything if I try hard enough," end quote. And my 13 or 14-year-old self surely answered with a strongly agree on the liquor type instrument, to which my friend sitting next to me responded something to the tune of, "What are you, fucking retarded? If my goal," and this is a quote from her directly because I will never forget this, "if my goal is to become a giant pink squid and eat the world but still live in the ocean, it doesn't matter how hard I try, now does it? That's impossible." And aside, that is exactly what self-efficacy is. Being able to accomplish one's goals, and more importantly, believing one can accomplish one's goals. I mean, technically, every American has the ability to become president if they meet the basic criteria of age, right? But that doesn't mean you're ever gonna be president. Not ever. I bring this up though because students who think they can succeed are also more likely to engage in self-regulated learning strategies. And again, that makes sense, as a hopeless student would simply be less likely to even try, right? A hopeless student isn't going to try to succeed because they know that they can't succeed. They have no self-efficacy. So what we found is that these regulatory learning strategies are correlated both with self-efficacy and with motivation. That is, that students who believe they have an ability to affect their education are more likely to engage in these positive learning strategies. That also tends to lead to higher learning outcomes. Similarly, students who are more motivated to be interested in their topic matter are more likely to engage in these strategies and again have higher positive educational outcomes. Now, if you're not sure yet, hold up fam, because as always I am going someplace with all of this, even if it seems as if I am not. Fan 2010 suggested, for example, that there was a potential link between critical or reflective thinking ability and self-regulatory learning strategies as well, which as we have just covered, are similarly correlated to self-efficacy and motivation for learning. This is a logical line of thought, given that critical thinking is a higher form of information synthesis, and we would expect students who use more self-regulating learning behaviors to have greater educational outcomes, again, as we have seen, including greater critical thinking in regards to any given topic. Coupier 2002 found evidence for greater self-reflective behavior in nursing students who engaged in self-regulated learning behavior. Further, Ganizadeh, sorry if I butchered that, 2017 found that critical thinking was positively correlated with some types of self-regulatory learning behavior amongst Iranian students. And in this data output here, we can see, once again, how habitual action, that is, the information regurgitation, the lowest level of understanding in the model is actually negatively correlated with every other variable assessed, including GPA. The point is that we can see how self-regulated learning behavior is a type of moderator variable on critical or reflective thinking. That is, you may not need to engage in these behaviors to arrive at higher levels of concept comprehension, however, it is likely helpful to do so, or at least advantageous. And why does that matter? Well, in this instance, because we understand there is a correlation between self-regulatory learning behaviors and both self-efficacy, feeling as though one can accomplish a task, and motivation toward a task. My point is this: if the goal of your class, the stated goal in your syllabus is to promote student learning toward the outcome of critical thinking, then giving them something fucking interesting to chew on and allowing students to feel as though they can be the masters of their own educational fate in a way to allow them self-efficacy, to feel as though their voices can be heard in an open forum, well then, to me, it looks as if we have a solid line of reasoning that would suggest those students would be more likely to develop the critical thinking skills, which are not only the specific, special purpose of this course in particular, but should be the desired outcome for pretty much any college level class, really for any class in general. This is the stated goal of pedagogy. That is, in order for students to develop these higher learning outcomes, they should probably feel as if they have an ability to affect their own lives and particularly their own education, to experience self-efficacy, and to discuss topics to which they are interested, right? Therefore, banning the discussion of all ideas from the classroom is not just bad for free speech, no, because again, I'm going outside of your free speech is bad bullshit, Wilfrid Laurier.
I mean, the Nazis actually used, this is a historical, issues around the free speech idea in the 1920s in Weimar, Germany, as an issue around which is what they're using now.
It is certainly unlikely, in addition, to be advantageous for the pedagogical outcome of your students. You are doing your students a disservice. Do you want your students to learn critical thinking skills? Your syllabi certainly states as much, but your actions betray you. As such, to block the discussion of interesting topics, as Lindsay Shepherd herself said, the most interesting topic of the semester, and prevent students from discussing those topics, thereby diminishes the educational efficacy of students, very arguably creating an environment that is non-conducive to just that, education. And with that in mind, let's quickly address how these effects are not limited to undergraduates. As we have seen in nurses, these same effects of self-efficacy, motivation, and thereby self-regulatory behaviors ultimately culminating in greater self-reflection and critical thinking certainly apply then to graduate students as well, right? I would imagine that a university that does not allow graduate students freedom in their own classrooms extends that same level of stringency to their research work, I could be wrong, but that's just a guess. As such, how much efficacy or motivation might the typical graduate student feel towards their work at Wilfrid Laurier? Might they then purposefully constrain themselves and their work to ideas that just are going to appease the faculty? Work that is external in its onus, which, as we have seen, is negatively correlated to learning outcomes? It would seem likely to me. Thus, not only is this environment potentially creating a bunch of intellectually impoverished undergrads, but also graduate students as well, who are probably going to be unmotivated and feel incapable of novel thinking and critical synthesis, only to likely go on and then perpetuate the cycle as they themselves become professors and educators. And thus we end up in the mess we're in, right? I mean, look at what happens when a liberal graduate student took even a minor step outside of the line to open up the floor for discussion. Look at what happened. She was castigated. One last thing I want to point out about the treatment of Lindsay Shepherd and about graduate work in general is imposter syndrome. Many of you have probably heard of something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which essentially posits that people of moderate intelligence and lower intelligence tend to believe themselves to be much more intelligent than they truly are. People of higher intelligence tend to appraise themselves more critically, potentially more honestly, but whatever. Similarly, however, imposter syndrome is a psychology term frequently applied to graduate and doctoral students, or really anyone in positions of success, that finds that typically the highest achieving people, the highest achieving students, feel as though they are inadequate and unworthy of their position within the university in this instance, and that at any moment, the faculty will discover their misplacement and banish them from said position. I have certainly felt that way. Many graduate students have felt that way. And I bring it up because if Lindsay Shepherd had in the past never experienced imposter syndrome before this witch hunt, I can more or less assure you that had she not recorded this conversation, she would have experienced it after the fact. The meeting's candor, the tone, the language all seemed designed, at least to me, to foster the notion that not only was she wrong in her actions of encouraging free speech and, as I believe we have just gone over, actually facilitating the stated goals of the course, but that she was somehow wrong, that she was somehow off as a person, and moreover, and more importantly potentially, as a student teacher.
Sorry, that's a little bit vague. Could you specify what you mean by moving forward? That's really general.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to talk about what you said, and then hopefully everything can continue and we can continue to have the working relationship that we do. But it's something I have to talk over with my colleagues because, frankly, some of the things that we talked about are a little bit problematic.
As a graduate student, your advisor is both your harshest critic and your best friend in many ways. And maybe it will be impossible for me to relate this in a video, but let me just say, as I've seen criticism for Lindsay for crying and that somehow makes her weak, pretty much anyone I know would have been crying, if not in complete hysterics, in a meeting like this with their advisor and people from the institution. Grad school is heavy lifting both mentally and emotionally, and this must have felt like a 1,000-ton brick was laying upon her back. This was, in my opinion, an intentional attempt to incur imposter syndrome in Lindsay, which is not only utterly reprehensible and beyond any mere words that I could possibly spit in scorn, but potentially abusive. That only makes the limp-wristed half-apologies from her advisor who continues to lay the blame upon Lindsay, to label her as somehow a poor instructor for introducing her class of adults to a course designed to encourage critical thinking, as somehow not in line with the course goals, despite the fact that those are the stated course goals. Or from the president herself, who seems only concerned that the audio was recorded and released, rather than the fact that one of her graduate students was, in my opinion, again, psychologically tormented. And look, I know how extreme that may sound, but in grad school is your entire life. You have worked hard to get there, and you respect the faculty with almost a deity-like reverence. Thus be placed in this position, as I'm sure her advisor does know about, considering he must be aware, he went through it, the realities of imposter syndrome, or about the excessive stress placed upon graduate and doctoral students, resulting in nearly 40% reporting feeling hopelessness, 78.5% feeling overwhelmed, 27.2% feeling depressed, and 54.5% with stress ranging from more than average to tremendous, which, yes, again, is lower in general than undergraduates, but therein again comes the potential for error in statistics in that reporting in and of itself of graduate students, once again, may reflect graduate student desires or needs to be perfect, to not say, I'm so upset by this because I'm too good for it. I cannot be psychologically disturbed. Call me out, say I'm wrong, but at least to me, these don't seem like people who are incredibly concerned with the well-being of their students. These are people who seem concerned because they got caught doing something reprehensible. And yes, to be completely honest, I do consider what they did to Lindsay Shepherd as teetering upon abuse. Thus, now that the communication department, fucking A, how this torments me, is suddenly up in arms complaining about harassment that they are supposedly now facing, Pixar, it doesn't happen by the way, in response, I am sorry, but I have very little sympathy for you. Of course, absolutely of course, no one should be harassing anyone here, that is without question, as always, fucking don't do that shit. But the department should be under fire for what I consider to be a blatant attack on this student teacher who was only living up to the very criteria of education provided within the syllabus of the course she was teaching. A student who was apparently facilitating the very type of critical learning the class is intended to facilitate. This is infuriating to me, and it should be to all of you as well, particularly now that we can see how potentially deleterious this type of restrictiveness is, not just to undergraduates, but to graduate students as well, and as a result to the health of the entire academic system as a macro entity. This right here is indicative of a cancer upon the entire university system that is self-perpetuating. It is growing in its virulence and more awful in its vile pustulence. This right here, this saying that to merely hold a debate is evil, It is wrong. That is the very antithesis of what the ivory tower once stood for in shining defiance against anti-intellectualism, anti-education, anti-ignorance, and against magical thinking. The academy was designed to serve the minds of those with a passion and thirst for knowledge, not to enslave that passion and deprive that thirst with intellectual celibacy. Nay, it is utterly incongruous with the stated goals of education to not only stifle the expression and open trade in the marketplaces of ideas, but more insidiously to seemingly intentionally siphon from the wealth of human knowledge any drop that displeases the senses of my sensibilities, not only from any individual student, but from the well at large, a drain upon the pool of information poured from the minds not of just one's contemporaries, but from the countless ages upon which this pool was formed, all in utter and complete irreverence to the sacrifices made to establish such institutions of higher learning and gain the ability for freedom of expression of ideas. Yes, Wilfrid Laurier and individuals like Dr. Rambucana may be mere symptoms of a disease, but a disease that is represented is a plague that threatens to destabilize the very concept of education as a concept. Perhaps now more than ever does the phrase "Doctor, heal thyself" have some meaning. Tower, heal thyself. Once again, I must shake my head in shame of the institution that I hold so dear. And call me hyperbolic, for perhaps I am, but unlike some, I deeply respect the concept of the academy, the idea of the academy, and as such, to see it sullied, to see it stained, is a stain not only upon my own reputation and even my own sense of self-worth, but as I perceive it, this is a stain upon Western civilization as a whole. We have abandoned education. And thus, before I closed, I really wanted to go into my raw analysis of that tape. And I was going to place it here, but honestly, I think I've kind of exhausted myself, and there's really nothing I can say that hasn't already been said from another perspective, other than the fact that this professor, these faculty members, they gaslighted her, they accused her of law breaking, and most egregiously, they expressed extensive disgust at what I believe to be the very core of the academy.
The thing is, can you shield people from those ideas? Am I supposed to comfort them and make sure that they are insulated away from this? Like, is that what the point of this is? Because to me, that is so against what a university is about. So against it. I was not taking sides. I was presenting both arguments.
The free expression and exchange of ideas. Why then go to university if not to have your ideas challenged, if not to engage in critical thinking? If that is not the purpose, for it certainly is the purpose stated in your syllabus. If that is not the purpose, then what is it? Because I certainly can't find it. Oh, hang on, I've got it. It's to indoctrinate. That's what your purpose is. Well, it's not mine. And it's not the purpose for which the academy was founded. As such, I suggest you delete yourselves. You are the antithesis of knowledge. And with that, I hope I've provided some unique insight into this entire debacle and explicated why this is wrong, not just from the obvious standpoint of the subjugation and stifling of free speech, but from a more complicated academic and educational standpoint. And that is far more, shall I say, robust of an argument, given we live in an era where free speech is now apparently a tool only utilized by totally 100% legitimate Nazi Klansmen, because those are a thing. Pro tip, they're not. I'm sure some feminist academics have certainly convinced themselves that the dressing down of this liberal girl for merely supporting not only the goal of the academy, such as it is, or was more accurately, to promote higher learning and critical thinking within her students, and to fulfill the stated goals of her very course at the micro level, not even at the macro university level. I'm sure some feminist scholars have justified it to themselves because, of course, as we all know, free speech is evil, and Dr. Jordan Peterson is literal Hitler. By the way, I'm not super pleased with him lately either, but he's certainly no Adolf. But I don't think even those feminist scholars could as easily argue with the fact that this right here, this is not good for student learning. This is not good for pedagogy, at least based on the data I provided in this video, which again derives both from empirical, quantitative research and live experience, qualitative and hermeneutical research. Thus, I would ask someone like Dr. Christy Winters, should your students' intellectual growth be retarded, such that you can maybe avoid offending a student or two by exposing them to very, very public materials? Or is the purpose of the academy not to develop critical and reflective thinking skills, but rather only to indoctrinate the uninitiated into your particular line of thinking and narrative, regardless of any negative psychological or educational harm placed upon the members of the stunted system that you have created? You know, Just an open question to a fellow pedagogue. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.